Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Vidisha and I write a column called Economics where I look at all things economics, not just markets and policy, but how economic forces actually show up in our everyday lives. Today's conversation sits very squarely in that space. It's about household finances, it's about debt, jobs, wages, and the quiet pressures building beneath India's growth story. Joining me is Saurabh Mukherjee, founder and chief investment officer of Marcellus Investment Managers. Saurabh is also the former CEO of Ambit Capital and has been deeply involved in shaping India's portfolio management framework through his work with SEBI and industry bodies. In his recent writing, Saurabh has turned his attention away from markets and more towards households, examining debt, consumption, wage growth, and the behavioral forces shaping India's middle class. That's the lens, I feel, that through which today's conversation should be framed and is framed. So Saurabh, thank you so much for joining
My,
us.
my pleasure, Vidisha. We're big fans of the print in Marcellus. So every Sunday morning, for
Huh?
many years now, we publish something called the three longs and three shorts. So
Okay.
inevitably, usually in the longs, there will be a long article from the print. So
Mhm.
we're very grateful that you and your colleagues in print write excellent pieces, which throw light on the Indian economy. Not many people write stuff which now throws light on the Indian economy. So very grateful to everybody at print.
Pleasure. Saurabh, you've spent most of your career, studying markets, capital allocation, and long-term wealth creation. The piece that you wrote lately, however, steps away from markets and focuses very sharply on households and, let's say, lived economic stress. So my first question to you is, what prompted you to write this essay now? Was it primarily the RBI's financial stability report, or was this something you'd been thinking about for some time?
Sure. So I think first aspect, Vidisha, is several of us in Marcellus are trained economists, right? So we've either studied economics at the postgraduate level, or some of my colleagues have studied economics at undergrad, and we've written extensively about the economy, not just on markets. We've written best-selling books on the Indian economy, and as a result of writing those books, we end up taking say around 200 flights a year, usually to do on-the-ground economic research. So there's a bunch of cities that we visit every 6 months. So we've created our own panel, if you so to speak, with a bunch of cities that we visit every 6 months, and we meet much the same people to understand what's happening in the economy. So, for example, there's a town 150 kilometers north of Mumbai on the Mumbai-Gujarat border called Boisar, right? It's a small semi-industrial town flanked by villages, right? Flanked by agricultural rural villages, and Boisar is a very interesting town to study what's happening in the manufacturing sector because it's far enough from Mumbai not to be influenced by the market hype and hoopla of Mumbai, right? Similarly, Coimbatore in South India is a thriving manufacturing hub for many decades now, and again far enough from Mumbai not to be influenced by the manias and madness that grips both Mumbai and Delhi in a different way. Delhi is sort of infused with political mania, but Mumbai with financial mania. So those trips usually give us a good grounding on what's actually happening in the country. And around 2.5 years ago, we started noticing something very odd, right? Something we hadn't seen in India before. What we started noticing 2.5 years ago was, on the one hand, we started noticing that white collar jobs were dwindling, both in IT services and in financial services. So prominent banks told us, and they were talking the talk, they're walking the talk at the branch level. Prominent banks told us that automation now has reached such a high level of sophistication that they can add 400, 500 branches every year without adding to their staff count. And similarly, we could see the IT services companies, the big IT services companies, were not adding employees. Some of them actually went on record saying that they plan to double their businesses and halve their headcount, right? So we could see jobs were dwindling. Um, and paradoxically, we could see uh, boom in items that had historically not boomed in India. So, for example, rock concerts, right? So, whilst I'm a music fan, and I'm delighted that Coldplay tours Mumbai and Linkin Park tours Mumbai, and these are expensive tickets, 7,000 rupees a pop, and whether it's in Mumbai or in Bangalore or in Hyderabad or in Delhi, these concerts are sold out. And I'm just using two examples of prominent bands. So we got very intrigued that people have enough money to pay 7,000 rupees for concert tickets. Uh, Remember, this is at a time when you can see in the income tax data, in the government's income tax data, over the last 10 years, the average income taxpayer's payment has barely gone up. So over 10 years, if you look at the government's income tax data, roughly the average income taxpayer pays to 10 and a half lakhs, earns 10 and a half lakhs, right? And therefore salaries are stagnant, and there's many different cuts at which you can see. Salaries are stagnant, white collar salaries are stagnant. Yet not only are rock concerts booming, but say Indigo's ticket sales, number of tickets sold are growing at 8-9% a year. So we got very intrigued by this. That how is this happening? The jobs, white collar jobs are dwindling. Number of white collar jobs, and we triangulated this in many ways. Number of white collar jobs stopped growing around 2.5 years ago. Yet this whole luxury economy, and I'm not just saying luxury in the Gucci, Louis Vuitton sense of the word, but luxury in the sense of tens of thousands of people attending rock concerts, holidaying, and a lot of that seemed to be credit driven. And we were very intrigued by this was both a financial phenomenon, right? It can create very strange financial outcomes, which we'll hopefully discuss. But it was also a very different social phenomenon because my generation, my parents' generation, had simply not borrowed money to attend rock concerts, and yet survey after survey started saying that the most popular use of unsecured loans is to go on holiday, right? And 40% of holidays in India now are financed through unsecured loans, right? So very new India, a whole bunch of new things coming through, and that's why we got interested in the whole subject. We started looking at the RBI's financial stability reports more carefully, and as you'd expect, Vidisha, if in one of the poorest countries in the world, you are having people finance their holidays through borrowing unsecured loans at 11-12%, you'd expect the stress to show up. And sure enough, with all credit to the RBI, in the financial stability reports, they started reporting the beginnings of financial stress 2 years ago. And we're now seeing that play out a little bit more fully in spite of heavy rate cuts from our central bank.
That's very interesting. So on the face of it, I mean, some of the latest data appears reassuring. I mean, net household financial savings as a percentage of GDP have improved in the fiscal year 2025. But however, you argue that this improvement sort of masks a deterioration underneath. So according to you, what are the headline numbers exactly failing to capture? Like why is sort of, and also I would like to point out that the non-house retail credit has surged since 2019 and is increasingly being used to fund consumption rather than asset creation, as you rightly spoke about it. So why is this shift particularly worrying from an economic stability point of view?
Yeah. So let's start with the ratio you mentioned, right? Net household savings. So the
Yeah.
first thing to realize is it hit a 50-year low 2 years ago. So it went down to as low as I think 4.8%, which was as low as it was in 1977. Incidentally, quite close to my year of birth. That itself was staggering. That even though between 1977 to now, India's per capita income would have grown, I think, comfortably 20-fold, right? 1977 to now, in dollar terms, India's per capita income would have grown 20-fold. That net household savings was operating at levels as low then as net household savings in 2023 was hitting the levels of 1977. It was bizarre, right? We could barely fathom what was going on. We spent a lot of time talking to various friends in Delhi and in the regulatory ecosystem in Bombay, right? Everybody was shell shocked. Everybody was shell shocked for that, right? We could barely fathom it. It's bumped off. It's come off a little of those incredible lows, right? But we're still at the 5% mark. Net household savings, 5% of GDP, right? You're not going to get very far developing a country. You're not going to get very far developing a country if your net household savings. And for those who are interested in this, the net is household savings minus households borrowing divided by GDP. So if you're saving, if that's your surplus, then you can't really finance development with that, right? But there's a more nuanced point that my friends in the banking system told me over the last 6 months. They told me, and our economist Nandita, she and I work closely on this. They told us, look, you guys are barking up the wrong tree here by looking at the net figure. because their view is the people who are borrowing are not the people who are saving. It's two distinct parts of society, right? The part of society which is saving money, arguably, is slightly more affluent people, successful business people, senior executives. They have high savings rate, and they're driving the savings number, right? But the part of the ecosystem that's borrowing, which is the vast majority of the country, right? The RBI's data now shows that 60% of people under the age of 30 are borrowing money. Right? Remember, the median Indian is 28 years old, which means the majority of Indians are below the age of 30. And the RBI's data showing the majority of people end up being borrowers, 60% end up being borrowers before they hit the age of 30. So the people who are borrowing are very different from the people who are saving. And the view that I got from smarter people in the ecosystem is the people who are borrowing, they're getting deeper and deeper into the mire with each passing year, right? And that piece, to capture that piece, I think we need to understand three sets of data. The first set of data is around job creation, right? Now, obviously, if I look at the standard data sets like PLFS, right, they're perpetually showing job creation, right? And beyond the point, I realize that they're not very useful because they're not really capturing high value job creation. By high value, I mean not crores, I mean people earning, say, 5 lakhs or better, right? Remember, per capita income in our country is 2 lakh rupees, right? So it's a very poor country. It's one of the poorest. India is now one of the poorest 40 countries in the world. In fact, on per capita income, we've slid down the global rankings over the last 20 years. So, given that per capita income is as low as 2 lakhs, someone earning 5 lakhs in India is actually doing really well. If you want to capture that job creation, then the best data set is Naukri.com. Naukri is part of a company based in Delhi called InfoEdge. It's a listed company. We've been long-standing shareholders. And Naukri is a jobs portal, right? So if you want a job, you go and upload your CV. If you're seeking a job, if you're an employer like Marcellus and you want to hire people, you go and pay a subscription fee to see the CVs of aspirants, right? So it's a good measure of activity. If you see that, you see that last 2 years, job creation growth in India is 1% CAGR. In contrast, from 2010 to 2020, jobs in India grew at 11% per annum. So 11% per annum means every 6 years, the number of white collar jobs in India doubled. Between 2010 and 2020, every 6 years, the number of white collar jobs in India doubled. Last 3 years, the number of jobs in India basically has stopped growing. And the big culprits here are IT services, which has stopped hiring people. Right, effectively, net job creation in IT services is zero over the last couple of years. And other big culprits are the retail sector. And this is very interesting, right? Retail, you think would employ a lot of people, right? The booming shopping malls that we see, the quick commerce ecosystem. But the data is suggesting retail jobs are also shrinking. And then modest job creation, far more modest than was the case historically in banking and financial services. So through three big parts of the economy, jobs have conked off, and that explains the difficulty that graduates are having in getting jobs. Right. So that's the first set of data. There's plenty of other ways to attack the jobs piece, the organized sector jobs piece, but the data is pretty grim. The second set of data is that, if you, as an economist, you sit back and think that if we have 10 million graduates joining the labor force every year, and there are no new jobs being created, what would you expect to see happen, right? The economist in me says that real wages would go down. So then you have to then do the crunch on real wages, right? Now, where should we turn to? So we said, let's turn to the mightiest companies in India, the companies who are doing the best, right? Let's turn to the Nifty 50. So we took the 50 largest companies in India, Vidisha, by market cap. We took their total wage bill from their annual reports. We took their total headcount, and we calculated per capita wages for the top 50 companies. Then for the same 50, we calculated per capita wages a decade back, right? And thus we got nominal growth in wages. We subtracted from that the CPI inflation rate, and we were stunned to see that even if you believe that the CPI inflation number actually measures middle class inflation, which I don't think it does. I think CPI inflation understates middle class cost of living inflation. But even if let's assume for a minute that CPI inflation is doing a reasonably accurate job of capturing the cost of living hike that the print's viewers have, the data suggests that real wages are shrinking at 4 to 5% a year, right? Which means over a 10-year cycle, real wages are more than halving. right? So that's the second piece to, I think, look at, right? Real wages. I appreciate that there's no real wage index that's going to get published in any media publication, but it's important as economists or as interested observers of the Indian economy to understand the wages picture, which I think is suggesting that after adjusting for cost of living inflation, wages are shrinking in our country. I think that's the second set of data to look at, right? And the third piece to look at is volume growth of the sort of items which constitute the core of middle class life. So FMCG, right, toothpaste, uh, um, uh, uh, biscuits, food consumables, and consumer durables. Now, thankfully, here most of these companies are listed. So you can create a consumer durables volume growth number, right? So add up all the consumer durables you can think of: washing machines, fridges, kettles, irons, everything added up, including phones, throw mobile phones in as well, and do the same for FMCG. And you can track the data year upon year because these are all listed companies. And the data there is pretty clear that till around 2011, 2012, volume growth of both consumer durables and FMCG was around the 10% mark, right? And effectively over the last 15 years, that 10 has become 2. The 10 has become 2. The recent GST cuts has led to a welcome revival, but my reckoning is that's more an ephemeral event rather than a structural event, right? So if you want to understand the big picture around the core story of the middle class, right, I would say those are the three sets of data to focus on. Jobs, which we are using Naukri, but there's many other ways to cut the Naukri data, and all of those data sets are giving the same signal that white collar job creation has stopped altogether in India. Real wages, right? Again, there are salary surveys which are giving much the same signal that I'm getting from the Nifty 50 company wage analysis, and thirdly, the data around volume growth or underlying real growth in FMCG and consumer durables, right? And therefore the picture is of a seriously embattled middle class, and that's what led us to do a lot of work on what's happening if this is how stressed the middle class is. Where is the financial system? Because this sort of structural stress usually manifests in loan repayment stress, and for us as investors, that's obviously an important consideration, because if we stay invested in lenders who then blow up, we and our clients will be poorer for it.
Interesting. So, I mean, you specifically spoke about the CPI inflation bit. I was part of a conversation yesterday on macroeconomic policies for the Viksit Bharat 2047, and there was a very senior professor from the Delhi School of Economics who was also speaking regarding banking supervision and how CPI does not give like the entire picture of inflation. And he was also having, he was saying that for the overall picture, we also need data and inclusion of the producer's price index as well to get the complete picture. So yeah, I mean, you did talk about household stress. I mean, household stress rarely stays confined to households. I would say it tends to spill over the financial system, right? Nearly 44% of borrowers are now classified as near prime or subprime. So, at what point, according to you, does this become more than a household issue and start posing risks to lenders or say the broader system altogether? Why I'm saying this specifically is banks and NBFCs as well, they still report relatively healthy asset quality, but still slippages and write-offs are increasing for some reason. So do you think the financial system is underestimating how stretched household balance sheets have become?
There's many different parts to it. Let's go one by one. Let's think of the broader implications of what's playing out in front of us, right? Including this what this other expert in Delhi has suggested to you, that CPI is underestimating potentially inflation in India, right? I'm also of that school of thought. I think CPI is seriously underestimating inflation in India. Now, if I am right, and if this other expert in Delhi you've spoken to is right, then I think this has big ramifications, because if CPI is much higher than what the official metric is suggesting, then that means India has got its monetary policy wrong. That means the RBI shouldn't have cut by 125 bips in the last 12 months. The RBI shouldn't have infused as much liquidity as it should have. as it has ended up doing. I'm sorry, the RBI shouldn't have infused as much liquidity as it has done so in the last, not just last year, actually, last 7, 8 years. 7, 8 years. RBI has run an incredibly loose monetary policy for very long now, right? And had the RBI, just following this line of thought, had the RBI been more circumspect on rate cutting and monetary infusion, the rupee wouldn't have had a 990 handle on it, right? Because I think these are all linked developments. Had the rupee not fallen so much, the cost of imported goods wouldn't have been as high as they are today, right? And then carrying on with that line of thought, to the extent that much of what we buy in India is imported, right? I'm speaking to you on an imported laptop. I'm pretty sure you're speaking to me using electronic equipment which is imported. The lens in my specs are imported. I'm pretty sure your specs, either in their entirety or at least the lens, are imported. The phone on my left hand side is imported. The light I'm using for this discussion is imported, so on and so forth. Tomorrow morning, I'll fly to the capital city in a plane which is imported. The crude oil inside that will be imported. Had we not got our currency wrong, we wouldn't have suffered from the sort of imported inflation that we've lived through, right? So there's a whole bunch of linked events around measuring CPI properly, and therefore, if India is mismeasuring CPI, I think the macro consequences of that are manifold. Not least, we might have calibrated our monetary policy incorrectly. The second piece is around financial system stability, right? So I migrated to India in 2008. Before that, I used to analyze financial services companies in the UK to earn a living. So I've looked at lenders for the best part of 25 years, right? And I've seldom seen the sort of boom in NBFCs in any country in the manner that I've seen in India over the last 5 years, right? So India has seen an absolute explosion in NBFCs. Anybody with a pulse and a heartbeat can open an NBFC in India and start lending money, right? And those sorts of explosions in lending activity typically happen at times of great monetary easing, right? And I submit to the Print's viewers that we've lived through great monetary easing in India. Now, if you increase the number of NBFCs rapidly. Remember, folks, NBFCs are not funded by depositors. NBFCs borrow money in the wholesale market in Mumbai, typically 1 year money, and they lend it to the public for buying mobile phones, cars, houses, and so on. So they borrow short term and they lend longer term. They live through what's called asset liability mismatch, and they borrow many multiples of their net worth, right? They're leverage, that's called leverage borrowing, many multiples of the net worth, and they face this time mismatch where they borrow short-term money and they lend long-term money, right? So these are fragile financial institutions in any country, not just in India. NBFCs are inherently fragile financial institutions, and therefore, whenever you have a boom in NBFCs, it's not very far, a bust is not very far away. So the most spectacular bust I've read about, I wasn't living in India then, but I've read about it, is in the late 90s. In the late 90s, 80% of India's NBFCs went under. It was incredible. And even just thinking about it, it sounds insane. So we used to have in 1995, India had 80,000 NBFCs. By the turn of the century, India had only 10,000. Right. So that's the second piece. That if we have got monetary policy more loose than it should be, then more money has come into the lending ecosystem than should have. That's what's financing these concerts where the world's best musicians are turning up in India and charging effectively $100 a pop, effectively close to $100 a pop, for our young folks to go and sing and dance, right? But if that is credit funded, as much of it seems to be, basis the anecdotal evidence that we're gathering, and if Indians' vacations in Maldives and Mauritius is also to a great extent credit funded, then there will be a day of reckoning for the NBFCs. That's the second piece I think we need to be careful about. And again, credit to the RBI. The financial stability reports are suggesting that there's a significant minority of Indian borrowers, somewhere around the 10% mark, who have got into a pickle where they've got themselves a home loan, a car loan, multiple unsecured loans, multiple credit cards. And reading the FSR, my reading is these Indians are never going to be able to repay their debts and are probably going to head for a default at some stage. Typically, that will happen when there is an abrupt tightening in monetary policy, right? So that's the second piece we need to think about. One is macro policy setting, right? Have we got money supply, interest rates, exchange rate right, or have we distorted it? Second is, have we got the lending ecosystem right? Have we distorted that as well in our keenness to flood the system with money supply, right? And the third piece is around competitiveness, right? Third piece is around competitiveness. If you create a credit economy flooded with, if you create an excessively buoyant credit economy, you push up the price of everything, including the price of land. And if you push up the price of land, you push up the price of offices, you make it very difficult for Indian manufacturing to be globally competitive. So what we have seen in India over the last 4 or 5 years is prices of industrial land in many parts of the country, including say Maharashtra, including Gujarat. Um, Prices of industrial land are now approaching levels seen in say France and Holland, right? So we are barely 1/30th the per capita income of France or Holland, and the prices of industrial land are approaching very high levels, levels at which most of my friends, and my friends run companies with say turnover of 300, 400, 500 crores. They're saying it's simply impossible to make money if we set up a factory now at these prevalent prices of land in Maharashtra, Gujarat, or indeed in several other parts of the country. I'm using Maharashtra, Gujarat because I live in Maharashtra. And the problem they're pointing to is this is assuming you get the land. In many cases it's actually close to impossible to get industrial land, right? So by creating an overly buoyant credit economy on the back of an excessively loose monetary policy, I think there are many different ramifications. And if in the inflation gauge on which policy setting is being done is off center, then the macro ramifications excuse me, the macro ramifications are multiple, including the currency being more depreciated than it than it should have been.
Interesting. In your essay, you spoke about jobs and wages, and they emerge as the core of the problem. So
Yeah.
white collar job growth has slowed sharply since the pandemic. Why do you think? That's my first question to you, as to why do you think this slowdown hasn't really featured more prominently in policy discussions or public debate? And you also argue that the official inflation data significantly understates the real cost of living faced by middle class households. You have spoken about this earlier as well, but I would still like to sort of draw this question from an urban India perspective, draw this point as to why does CPI fail to reflect the lived inflation for urban India, according to you?
Yeah. So I think the second question is easier. So let me answer that, and then I'll go to the first question on jobs and the policy discourse. Right now, think about the policy. Think about the people who are running our statistics apparatus. Right, they know that there's only 40 million Indians who pay income taxes. Right, so there's only 40 million Indians who pay income taxes. There's many more filers, but for many years now, I think 5 years now, the number of payers of IT is only 40 million, right? Let's call them officially the middle class, right? That's my official definition of middle class. They also know that there are 940 million voters in the country. So they ask themselves, should we create a CPI index for the 900 million who are not the middle class? Or should we create a CPI index for the middle class, right? And in all fairness to the people who run our statistics apparatus, I think they're justified in saying, let's create a CPI index which measures the lived experience of the non-middle class, right? The other 900 million people who are below the 5 lakhs income threshold, right? So that's where I think they are coming from, right? So for a person earning say 2-3 lakhs, half their income potentially goes in food, and therefore CPI has, I think, 48% weightage on food. Right? I doubt anybody watching this podcast has half their income going on food, but the CPI index is not meant for people who are watching this podcast. It's meant for the other 95% of India who don't constitute the middle class, right? From my perspective as an investor, I'm interested especially in that middle class, because that middle class pays 70% of India's income taxes, drives 40-50% of the consumption, and that middle class in turn creates a dynamic which results in another 200 million people getting employment. Right. So as an investor, my interest is in the middle class, but the statistician is not really focused on the middle class because there's 90% of the country is not in the middle class. Right? I think that dichotomy I don't have an easy answer to, and I'm glad that's not my problem. It's the problem of the people who have to run the statistics apparatus. Do they want to create a CPI middle class, which will be very different from the CPI metric which is reported? Why? Because CPI middle class, for example, will include private sector hospital costs, which are rising at anywhere between 10 to 15% per annum. Right? I know because I have aged parents, and I also know because our company buys health insurance for our employees, and the insurance premiums ramp at 10 to 15% per annum. If there was a CPI middle class, it would capture the runaway inflation in school fees. I know because I have two teenage children for whom I have to pay school fees, and those escalate at 9-10% per annum. If there was a CPI middle class, it would capture the fact that the cost of a small car, right? I'm not talking like expensive cars, say a car like an Alto, Maruti Alto, the cost of that has CAGRed at 8-9% over the last 5 years as well, right? If there was a CPI middle class, it would capture the fact that if you go to a decent restaurant in Mumbai and have a vegetarian thali, I'm not talking going to the Taj. It's going to a decent restaurant in Mumbai, have a vegetarian thali, the cost of that also ramps at 8-9%, right? But there isn't a CPI middle class, and hence the discussion you and I are having is at one level theoretical, but at another level is very real, because the people watching this show, their cost of living is ramping at 8-9, and if their salaries are not ramping at 8-9, which is what our analysis suggests, salaries are not ramping at 8-9 for the middle class, then in real terms, salaries are going down, right? So that's the easy part, right? Now let's get to the thorny part, the jobs piece. I think to give our policymakers credit, they are burning the midnight oil on the white collar jobs piece. So, for example, there's a lovely in the sense, detailed Niti Aayog report published in October 2025, Niti Aayog with NASSCOM and Boston Consulting Group, where they've done fairly detailed analysis of the impact of AI on jobs in the IT services sector and what they call the customer experience sector, which is call centers, salespeople, and so on. And basis the work they've done, they reckon something like a fifth of the jobs could be gone by 2031. Fifth of the jobs in these sectors, IT services and customer experience, right? Core middle class heartland jobs, a fifth of them could be gone by 2031. And again, to be fair to the policy operators, both this economic survey, the one that was published in 26, and the 2025 economic survey has extensively spoken about AI and the potential disruption that they can cause, right? So I think the policy makers are seized of the problem. The challenge, I think, for them and for all of us, right? And I think this is a national problem. This is not a singularly policymaker problem. And the challenge for them is that it's not apparent that our workforce, that the Indian workforce is designed to deal with something like AI. And I think that's where we need to have a really hard look at the education system. So I'll tell you what I saw, and why as we got out of COVID, I got very interested in this subject. So I've lived in India now for 16 years, and I've been recruiting throughout that period. So I've been interviewing Indian graduates now, actually for longer than that. I've been interviewing Indian graduates for 20 years. So even before I came to India, I used to recruit bright young Indian talent. And what I noticed over the last 20 years was a steady erosion in the quality of graduates, right? So I got very intrigued by this. Why are the quality of graduates eroding over time? So as late as far back as 2010, 2011, say legends like Narayan Murthy ji would give newspaper interviews about the erosion of standards in India's premier universities, right? And what the discourse was around is somewhere around the turn of the century, university entrance exams moved from proper writing out proper answers in essay format to multiple choice questions. So basically, around the turn of the century, a generation ago, our political system said that let's expand access to university education. Let's make it easier to get in. The number of IITs expanded, the number of IIMs, I think, also expanded. And more generally, I think across the country, there was a explosion in the number of universities. And this seems, I think, in due course, this caused two issues. One was the supply of graduates went up. If you obviously create many more IITs, many more IIMs, many more universities, you'll have far more graduates, right? Which immediately puts pressure on the pressure on the wages of the freshly graduated students, right? If you have so many of them, 10 million of them, if you have 10 million graduates a year, there's going to be wage pressure on them. So that's challenge number one. But the challenge number two was to get all of these universities filled up, all these medical colleges, all these engineering colleges, all these business schools filled up. The entry standards were lowered. So the university degree got devalued, right? In an effort to democratize, in an effort to democratize higher education, we ended up devaluing the university, the quality of university education. So I think a double whammy kicked in long before COVID, right? And I don't think any one government, state, center is to blame for this. This is, I think, a system level challenge that we encountered somewhere around the turn of the century, and we decided, I think, very knowingly as a democracy, that we will have many more universities, many more students, many more degree holders, which then squeezes compensation for those who have a degree. And secondly, the quality bar was lowered, right? Now, with that, you enter AI, right? With that, you enter AI. So India's main asset entering the AI era is we have lots of graduates, 10 million a year. The challenge is AI is not very sympathetic to the fact that these graduates might not be up to the mark in the global job market, right? So if what a newly minted LLB law graduate can do, if Anthropic can do it just as well, hey, too bad. The lords of the universe will say, too bad. Anthropic will now on do the legal drafting. We don't need this LLB graduate. If a newly graduated electrical engineer can code half the speed, or I'm sorry, if a newly graduated electrical engineer codes at three, four, 5 times the speed of an AI bot, then the software companies will say, we will happily use a bot. We don't need fresh young coders, right? So this is where I think we are entering an era of great technological disruption, much like the weavers in the face of technological change in the industrial revolution, or the candle makers and in the era of Edison and the electric bulb, right? So we are faced with the candle maker electric bulb era of disruption. Just that those were in countries with low populations. We are entering this era of great tech disruption in a country where the median Indian is 28 years old and 10 million graduates are coming in. I think that's the backdrop against which this whole jobs issue is. I think our policymakers are seized of it, but neither they nor I have a easy solution to how do we navigate our way out of this era of white collar jobs drying up.
Interesting. Also, Saurabh, what I really liked about that piece that you wrote was that beyond economics, you place a lot of emphasis on behavior and psychology. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You write that social media has democratized aspiration without democratizing income. How powerful a force is this in driving borrowing and consumption today, in your view? More than a quarter of personal loans. I would also like to add here that more than a quarter of personal loans have reported to be used to just fund vacations. So, does this signal a deeper cultural shift in how Indians think about debt and lifestyle?
Written on the impact of social media on the human mind, right? Lots of books have been written. I think thousands of newspaper columns must have been written, and millions of social media posts must have written how social media impacts your brain. So I don't think I have anything to add to that piece. What we noticed as we came out of COVID, what we noticed was three areas where India is singular, where India stands out in the global context. The first was we are very young, right? Uh, we are the youngest demography in the world, and as a result, social media has many more young people to feed off in India than in, say, the United Kingdom or Sweden, right? The Indian demographic is so young, the social media is able to grab Indians at a very formative stage in their existence, right? So for someone like my parents who live in the UK, social media entered their lives when they were in their 60s. So my parents still use social media, but they're peripatetic users of social media. Whereas for my teenage kids, it's central to their lives, right? So that's the first aspect that struck me, that we're very young and social media has hit us when we are very young. Second is the cost of mobile data. And cost of mobile data in India is 1/40th what it is in America and Europe. So obviously, if mobile data is virtually free, then you would expect the security guard in your and my building to be on social media all the time, and that's broadly what they are. Right? because it's virtually free. It's an easy way to while time, not just for the security guard, even for Indians of all ages, right? So that's the second aspect, which I think is important. That because there's no cost associated of being online in India, there's no financial hit to your pocket to being online. Naturally, many Indians are online all the time, right? And the third aspect to this is we are as is well known, we are one of the most unequal societies in the world, right? So we have 10% of the world billionaires. We have only 3% of global GDP, and we have 10% of the world's billionaires. Out of the world's 3,000 billionaires, 300 are in India. Actually, more than 300 in India. Just keep the numbers simple. So we have 3x the number of billionaires than we should have. So in a very unequal society, social media is that much more impactful because those earning a couple of lakhs can see the lifestyles of those earning hundreds of millions of dollars. And social media creates this false sense of equality. And remember, it has got AI embedded in it. So AI feeds people with very little money, curated images of luxury, right? Which actually have no relevance to them, but they're fed to them because that's how AI gives dopamine hits to all of us, right? Myself included. So these three aspects, right, struck us as we were coming out of COVID. COVID was a lot of social media for all of us. Perforce, we had nothing else to do. So as we came out of COVID, we said this troika is very powerful, super cheap social media, unusually cheap, unusually young people in a very unequal society, right? And now I guess we are seeing the impact of this, right? And the impact of this, as we were discussing, is people who can't afford holidays saying we also have to holiday in style, and it's easy to get a loan, right? So if Vidisha, you're ever interested, or the Prince viewers are interested, we're happy to take you on tours of small town India in almost any part of the country. Tours of small town India, where you go to India's most respected banks, and the bank manager will tell you that in our town, if you don't take a loan and go on holiday, you're seen as a loser. Right? That's how social norms have changed, right? In Western India, Northern India, less so the South, but Western North, if you don't take a loan and go on holiday, there's something wrong with you socially, socially, mentally, right? And similarly, as I was discussing, the data that you are sharing from our blog, which shows that 40% of, a significant chunk, 30% of unsecured loans are for holidaying. Another chunk is watching concerts, and there's a bigger chunk for there's a substantial chunks for mobile phones and so on. So I think this is a big deal, and we might be the first country in the world where loose monetary conditions, the proliferation of non-bank lenders interplays with social media, unusually cheap cost of mobile data, and an incredibly unequal society. I think there is a story there which I think, at least to me, doesn't sound very pretty. If anybody watching this believes it's pretty, please write to me, because I'm not being able to see the silver lining in what seems to me to be a Pandora's box of issues coming our way.
Um, Interesting, but I would still like to end the final question by looking forward and looking ahead. Although we do not see the silver lining, say, for instance, if we were to have this conversation again 5 years from now, what would convince you, rather, that India has successfully navigated this household debt challenge? And for the middle class families watching or listening to this conversation, what is that single most important mindset shift, according to you, that they need to make in the years ahead?
So look, I think, right, I don't think any of us have a choice. There's no social security system in our country. So whether we are middle class, low middle class, whatever class we are, we have no choice. We have to navigate the coming upheaval. So there are three sets of things which I think should give all of us cheer. The first is, we have written about this extensively. I think the government is now seized of the issue over the last year or so. The government is seized of the issue. In the 2025 union budget, we had income tax cuts, and subsequently we had GST cuts. The RBI's cut rates. I think more needs to be done, but I think the policymakers understand that we are heading into a challenging time where technological disruption interplays with financial forces to create nonlinear effects, right? So I think the first good news, the silver lining, is policymakers care, they understand the issue, and I think they're seized of gravity of the situation. I think the second silver lining is history suggests, right? Lots of case studies in history and lots of very good books, lots of labor economists have written on this. Is typically when technological upheaval comes, it comes in two waves. The first wave is the substitution effect, right? So this is the candle maker losing his job as Edison and General Electric come up with the light bulb. So America circa 1890, the candle makers and the people who lit the gas lamps in New York, they all lost their jobs around the turn of the around the end of the 19th century as Edison and GE bought the electric light bulb and made it very cheap, right? But 20 years later, Hollywood emerges, right? Motion pictures emerge, gramophones emerge, and a colossal entertainment industry emerges. That's called the complementarity effect. Now, it took 20 years then, back 100 years ago. Hopefully, it's not going to be 20 years this time. I think as early as 2 to 3 years hence, we will see we will see a new gig work economy emerging. I don't understand the full. I can't predict the full contours of the gig work economy that will emerge, but I think just using broad hazy outlines, I think that the entire uh, training of bots, the collection of data, all of that work will come to India, right? So America might have the LLMs, or China and America might have the large language models, but the training of bots. So say if a hospital chain in Ireland. If a hospital chain in Ireland says it doesn't want to answer patients' call, it wants a bot to answer the patient's call. The hospital chain in Ireland will give all the 10 years worth of phone records to AI trainer in Coimbatore. And in Coimbatore, somebody sitting in the bedroom will train the bots so that the hospital in Ireland can get rid of their telephone operator and stick a bot in there, right? That work, cleaning the data, labeling the data, training the bots, I think that could create 100 million plus jobs in India. But it'll take time for us to get there. But I think we will get there, right? We are a free market economy, and as I said, there's no social security safety net for any of us. So we will have to adapt and find a living. I think the third silver lining is, in a way, we're already down that path, right? As we were discussing, there is no net creation of white collar jobs really in India over the last couple of years, but the startup economy is booming, and our reckoning is somewhere around 40 to 50 billion dollars of venture capital is being annually made available, partly the venture capital ecosystem, partly the government's own efforts to provide seed capital. And that roughly 40, $50 billion of venture capital is going towards creating 1 million enterprises in India, right? So for many young people, both because of necessity and because of aspiration, right? Shows like Shark Tank have been very influential. Getting a job is no longer a priority in life. Building a business of their own is the way they think about it. And I think that's the right mental shift to make. I don't think the world that I grew up in, where you graduate, you get a job, you get promoted, you get appraisals, pay rises. I think that world is gone. It's finished, right? So anyway, we'll all have to become entrepreneurs, and we'll all have to enter the gig economy. It's great to see that India has a funding ecosystem, and India is creating a million entrepreneurs. So the way the way I think about this is that I say, V.S. Naipaul said all the way back in 1989, V.S. Naipaul said, India, a million mutineers now. I would say India, a million entrepreneurs now every year. And I think that's the positive take on it. We're living through a period of disruption, but I'm pretty sure we'll come out on the other side in a very different world, but a world in which I think.
Very interesting. Thank you, Saurabh, for your time and throwing light on a very very pertinent issue. I would like to say something that there should be more conversations regarding, but sadly we're not having, or probably conversations are happening around there, but I'm not that privy.
That's
And
the
I
right word. I think the conversations are happening in the policy making circles, but they probably should be happening in the broader society rather than just in
exactly,
policy making
exactly,
circles. Policy making
exactly.
circles.
Absolutely. And I mean, this conversation was very, very enriching for me, and I'm sure it will be for all the viewers in the print. And thank you to all who are watching. I mean, we will be looking forward to more of such pieces by you and analysis by you, so that we could have further conversations, and you could throw light on many more such issues. Thank you once again, Saurabh. Thank you so
Thank you.
much.